She was told to stay hidden, to cook the food, set the tables, and disappear before the guests arrived. And for 6 weeks, Rosalie Mercer did exactly that. Because she needed the money, and because she had learned long ago that women like her didn't get to take up space in rooms like that. But on the day of the wedding, in front of 200 people, the bride stood up and stole everything Rosalie had made, every dish, every hour, every drop of sweat, and turned it into a punchline. What happened next? Nobody in Wyoming saw coming. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The notice had been tacked to the post outside Dunmore's Feed and Grain on a Tuesday morning, printed on heavy cream paper and ink that smelled faintly of cedar, which struck Rosalie as an odd detail to notice, but she noticed it anyway. She had a habit of noticing small things. It was one of the few habits she'd managed to hold on to. Sought, experienced cook for large-scale wedding preparation. 6 weeks of work. Full meals, preservation, presentation. Ranch outside Heller's Creek. Discretion required. Inquire at the Ashcroft residence, Main Street. Rosalie stood on the boardwalk with mud drying on the hem of her skirt and read it twice. Then she pulled it off the post, folded it once, and put it in her coat pocket. The man behind her in line for feed didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She knew what people thought when they looked at her. The Mercer widow, the one whose farm was falling apart, the one whose husband had left her with 40 acres of clay soil and a mortgage that was eating her alive 1 month at a time. She walked back to her wagon, climbed up, and sat there for a moment looking at the mountains in the distance, pale and cold under the November sky. The farm needed a new roof before winter. The north fence had collapsed in August, and she'd patched it with wire and willpower, and it wasn't going to hold much longer. She owed the bank $68, and she had 11. She unfolded the paper and read it a third time. Discretion required. She already didn't like that part. The Ashcroft house on Main Street was the largest private residence in Heller's Creek, and everyone knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. It had been built by Clarence Ashcroft, Vivian's father, who had made his money in land speculation and cattle contracts, and a few other things people didn't discuss at church. The house had a wraparound porch and glass windows in every room, and a door knocker shaped like a horse's head, which Rosalie stared at for a full 5 seconds before lifting it. A housekeeper answered, middle-aged, thin-lipped, the kind of woman who had learned to make herself small in someone else's house, and had been doing it so long she'd forgotten it was a choice. "Rosalie Mercer," Rosalie said. "I'm here about the cook's position." The housekeeper looked her over the way people do when they're trying to figure out which category you belong to. Then she stepped back and let her in. The front room was everything Rosalie expected. Dark wood, heavy curtains, framed portraits of people who wanted you to know they had cheekbones. She stood and waited while the housekeeper disappeared through a door at the back of the hall. She heard Vivian before she saw her. The voice carried like a bell in an empty church, clear and musical and with just enough edge to it to let you know the music wasn't for you. Then Vivian Ashcroft came around the corner in a gray dress that probably cost more than Rosalie's horse and stopped short when she saw her. Vivian was beautiful. That was the first thing, and there wasn't any use pretending otherwise. She had the kind of face that painters used as an excuse, dark hair pinned up with practiced carelessness, eyes the color of deep creek water. She was 23, maybe 24, and she moved through a room like she expected it to rearrange itself for her. She looked at Rosalie the way you look at a piece of furniture you're considering returning. "You're the woman who wants to cook for my wedding," she said. Not a question. "I'm the woman who applied for the cook's position," Rosalie said. "Yes." Something flickered in Vivian's expression, mild surprise, maybe, at the phrasing. She gestured toward a chair. Rosalie sat. Vivian remained standing, which was probably intentional. "I've heard your name," Vivian said. "Your husband was Thomas Mercer." "He was. He passed 2 years ago." "He did. And you've been managing the farm yourself since then?" "I have." Vivian tilted her head slightly, like she was adjusting the angle of her assessment. "People say the farm is in trouble." Rosalie met her eyes. "People say a lot of things." That earned a small, private smile. "They do." Vivian moved to the window and looked out at the street. I'll be direct with you, Mrs. Mercer, because I find it saves time. My wedding will be the largest social event this territory has seen in a decade. 212 guests. The Whitlock Ranch is large enough to accommodate them, but the kitchen, Graham's cook left in September and hasn't been replaced. I need someone who can manage a feast of that scale from the ground up. 6 weeks of preparation, preservation, curing, baking, the full banquet day. I need someone competent. I'm competent, Rosalie said. Yes, I believe you might be. I've asked around. Vivian paused. But I have a condition. There it was. The thing Rosalie had known was coming since she read the word discretion on that piece of paper. What condition? She said. Vivian turned from the window. The Whitlock wedding will be attended by every significant family in this territory, and several from outside it. Investors, cattle barons, political figures. The image we present, that Graham and I present, is important. I need the food to be exceptional. I need the presentation to be flawless. But I don't need— She paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone arranging cutlery. I don't need it to be known that we brought in outside help. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. You want me to cook the wedding feast and pretend I wasn't there. I want you to cook the wedding feast and not be there. Not visibly. You'll work in the kitchen. You'll prepare everything. On the day of the wedding, you'll be finished and gone before the first guests arrive. Vivian paused again. No one needs to know your name. Rosalie sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, a horse cart rattled past. Someone called out a greeting from across the street. Normal sounds. Regular life continuing in its regular way while she sat in this room and was told, very politely, that her presence at the work she did was an inconvenience. How much? She said. $200. Rosalie's chest tightened. She kept her face still. $200 was more than 3 months of what the farm could produce in a good year. $200 was the roof and the fence and 2 months of mortgage and maybe a breathing room she hadn't had since Thomas died. I'll need access to the kitchen by the 1st of December, she said. Vivian nodded. That can be arranged. I'll need a full inventory of what's already in the stores. Of course. And a budget for what I need to source. Within reason. My reason or yours? Another small smile. We'll discuss it. Rosalie stood. She was taller than Vivian by 2 inches, and she stood up straight because she'd learned a long time ago that the only person who was going to hold her posture was her. One more thing, she said. The work is mine. Every recipe, every preparation, every decision in that kitchen. I'll take your preferences into account. But I don't take instruction on technique from people who haven't cooked for more than 10 people at a time. Vivian raised one dark eyebrow. Agreed, she said. They shook hands. Vivian's grip was firm, which surprised Rosalie. She filed it away with the other small things she noticed. The Whitlock Ranch sat 18 miles outside Heller's Creek, deep enough into the valley that the mountains blocked the north wind and the land settled into something almost gentle. Rolling grass, a creek that didn't freeze until January, stands of aspen and cottonwood that turned gold in the fall and were bare gray sticks by the time Rosalie arrived. She came with her wagon and her tools and her own set of cast iron pans because she didn't trust unfamiliar pans, and a preserving kit her mother had given her the year before she died. The ranch hand who met her at the gate was a boy of maybe 17 who told her his name was Curtis and showed her where to put the horse without making eye contact once. She appreciated that. The main house was substantial but not showy. 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, a wide porch that had seen 20 Wyoming winters and looked like it. The outbuildings were well maintained, the fences solid. Whatever Graham Whitlock was, he wasn't a man who let things fall apart. The kitchen was at the back of the house, separate from the main rooms by a short covered corridor, which was practical. It was a working kitchen, not a show kitchen. Long prep tables, a stove that was 4 feet wide and had seen serious use, a cold cellar that went down 8 feet into the earth. The ceiling was high enough that heat rose up and away from you. The windows faced east, which meant morning light. Rosalie stood in the middle of it and breathed in, and for the first time in longer than she could say, she felt something ease in her chest. She got to work. But the first 3 days she spent alone. She inventoried everything in the cold cellar and the dry stores. What was there? What was usable? What needed to go? She made lists in the notebook she carried everywhere, small, tight handwriting that her schoolteacher had once called cramped, but that Rosalie thought of as efficient. She planned the menu in stages. What needed to be started now to be ready in 6 weeks? What could wait until the second week? What had to be done fresh in the days immediately before the wedding? Pickled vegetables, cured ham and smoked shoulder, preserved fruits for the tarts, stock that would form the backbone of 4 different sauces, bread that would be baked fresh the morning of. She drew a calendar on the back page of the notebook and mapped it out day by day. On the 4th day, she met Graham Whitlock. She was at the stove at 5 in the morning, which was when she'd been starting every day because the kitchen was warmest then and the light came through the east windows, and she did her best thinking in the hour before the ranch came to life around her. She had stock simmering and was testing salt levels by dipping her finger in and touching it to her tongue, a habit she'd had since she was 12 years old, learning from her mother. When she heard the door, she turned around. He was tall, not in the way that calls attention to itself, but in the way that means furniture was always slightly the wrong height, dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that had been weathered by Wyoming the same way the porch had been. He was maybe 40 or looked 40, the kind of man who might be older than he appeared because he'd spent so much time outside that the elements had worked their way into the lines around his eyes. He wore work clothes, not gentlemen's clothes, and his boots had actual mud on them. He stopped when he saw her. "I didn't think you'd be here yet," he said. "I started Monday," she said. "I know, I just—" He stopped, glanced toward the stove. "I usually make my own coffee in the morning. I didn't want to intrude." Rosalie turned back to her stock and reached for the coffee pot, which was already on. She poured a cup and set it on the counter by the stove without looking at him. "Coffee's there." He came in and got it. He stood by the counter and drank it while she worked, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. Not the silence of people who didn't know what to say, but the silence of people who had both been up since before dawn and had already accepted the morning. After a while, he said, "What's in the pot?" "Beef stock. I'm building a base for the sauces. It has to go slow for at least another 4 hours." He looked at it. "You started this at what time?" 2. He was quiet for a moment. "That's early." "Good stock takes time. You can rush a lot of things. You can't rush stock." He drank his coffee. She tested the salt again. Outside, the sky was starting to change from black to gray, and the first sounds of the ranch were beginning. A rooster somewhere, a horse shifting in its stall. "I'm Graham Whitlock," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm Rosalie Mercer." "I know," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not unkind, not pitying, just straightforward, that made her think he'd actually looked into who she was before she arrived, which meant he'd probably heard the same things everyone heard about her, and he was telling her without actually saying it that he wasn't going to make it a topic of conversation. She appreciated that too. He finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it back where he'd found it. "I'll try not to be in your way," he said. "You're not in my way," she said. "It's your kitchen." "It's your kitchen for the next 6 weeks," he said. And then he went out through the back door into the gray dawn, and she heard his boots on the frost-hard ground, heading toward the barn. She stood at the stove and stirred the stock and didn't think about anything for a few minutes. Just the smell of it, and the quiet, and the light coming up through the east windows. Vivian arrived on the Friday of the first week. She came in a hired carriage with 2 trunks of clothing, and a woman she introduced as her personal attendant, whose name Rosalie never quite caught because Vivian introduced her the same way you'd point out a coat rack. She swept through the house in a way that made it clear she was already measuring it against what it would look like after it was hers, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway with her gloves still on and a look on her face that Rosalie was starting to recognize. The expression of someone who has decided in advance that whatever they find will be slightly below their standards. "Show me what you've done," Vivian said. Rosalie showed her. She walked her through the cold cellar, the hanging smoked meats, the rows of preserved jars, the stock she'd laid down, the planning calendar on the back of the notebook. She spoke clearly and specifically about each thing, which was how she always talked about food. Not with sentiment, but with the practical knowledge of what each stage was for. Vivian listened. She picked up a jar, looked at it, set it down. She opened the cold cellar and peered in. She asked two questions, both sharp and relevant, which told Rosalie she wasn't entirely ignorant of what she was looking at. Then she said, "The smoked ham, how long?" 3 more weeks minimum before it's where I want it, Rosalie said. And if we need it sooner? You'll have a ham that's not where it should be. Vivian looked at her. I'm asking whether you can adjust the timeline. I'm telling you that the timeline is what it is. Smoke and salt and time aren't things I can negotiate with. The silence stretched for about 4 seconds. Fine, Vivian said, and turned and walked out of the cold cellar and back toward the main house. Rosalie stood in the cellar for a moment with her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Then she went back to work. 1. The second week was the hardest. Rosalie was starting the large-scale preservation work, which meant long days and little sleep. The kind of sustained physical effort that her body had learned to handle, but that still cost something. She was up before 4 most mornings, working until after dark, and the only time she stopped was to eat something quick standing over the prep table or to step outside for 10 minutes in the cold air to clear her head. It was during one of those outdoor breaks, on a night when the temperature had dropped sharply and the sky was clear and so full of stars it almost felt dishonest, that Graham appeared again. He came around the side of the house from the direction of the barn and stopped when he saw her standing there with her arms crossed and her coat thrown over her work clothes. "Sorry," he said. "I saw the kitchen light and thought, I don't know what I thought. That something was wrong? That something might need attention. I just needed air," she said. He nodded. He stood a few feet away, looking up at the sky the way people do when they need somewhere to put their eyes. After a minute, he said, "How's it going in there?" "It's going," she said. "That's not really an answer. It's the honest one." She looked at the mountains against the dark sky. "It's a lot of work, but it's the right kind of work. I don't mind it." He was quiet. Then, "What's the difference?" "The right kind." She thought about it. The right kind is when you know why you're doing each thing, when every step connects to the step before and the step after, when you're not just following a recipe, you're building something. She paused. "Thomas, my husband, he used to say I talked about cooking like other people talk about architecture." Graham looked over at her. Was he wrong? Probably not. She glanced at him. He was wrong about a lot of things, but not that. It came out more plainly than she intended. She wasn't in the habit of talking about Thomas, especially not to near strangers. But there was something about standing outside at 11 at night with cold air in her lungs that made the usual rules feel less applicable. "I'm sorry about your husband," Graham said. Just that. No embellishments, no poor dear. No, the Lord has a plan. Just a plain acknowledgement from a person who seemed to understand that sometimes sorry was enough, and more than enough was too much. "Thank you," she said. They stood there for another minute, and then she went back inside and he walked toward the barn, and neither of them made anything of it. By the end of the second week, a pattern had established itself. Graham came to the kitchen in the early mornings, never past 6, usually closer to 5. He made coffee and drank it while she worked, and they talked or didn't talk in roughly equal measure. He asked questions about what she was doing that were always practical and never condescending. Not the questions of a man who thought cooking was below his understanding, but of a man who was genuinely curious about a process he didn't know. She answered them the same way she'd always explained anything, directly, with specifics, without softening it for a listener she thought couldn't handle it. He told her things too. Not personal things, at first, just ranch things. A problem with the water line to the east pasture. A difficult buyer in Cheyenne he was negotiating with. The way the cattle had been behaving in the cold, which apparently told you something if you knew what to look for, though she didn't. "You learn to read them," he said one morning, warming his hands on the coffee cup. "After long enough, they have patterns, same as people." "Most people aren't as predictable as they think they are," Rosalie said. "No," he agreed, "but they're more predictable than they'd like to be." She thought about Vivian, who had come into the kitchen twice that week and found small things to criticize. The way Rosalie had labeled the jars, the temperature she kept the cold cellar, and who had said each criticism in the pleasant, measured tone of someone who has decided they are being very reasonable. She didn't say anything about Vivian to Graham. It wasn't her place, and it wasn't a knot she wanted to start pulling at. Vivian came into the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon of the third week and found Rosalie testing a sauce that had been reducing for 2 hours. She tasted it off the spoon, adjusted, tasted again, made a note in the book. "What is that?" Vivian said. "Red wine reduction for the beef. I added juniper berries. It wants another 20 minutes. Vivian came to the stove and looked at the pot. "I don't like juniper in beef sauce." "You haven't tasted it." "I know what I like." Rosalie set the spoon down and turned to face her. "Miss Ashcroft, your guests are going to taste that sauce, and they're going to remember it. That is the point. If you want something forgettable, I can make you something forgettable. But that's not what you hired me for." Vivian's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it, a slight tightening around the jaw. "I'll taste it when it's done," she said. "Good idea," Rosalie said, and turned back to the stove. Vivian tasted it 20 minutes later and didn't say anything, which Rosalie had learned was her version of approval. She swept out of the kitchen, and Rosalie heard her voice carrying back down the corridor, bright and social, as she went to find Graham. Rosalie kept stirring. Chum. What happened on the Thursday of the third week was small enough that Rosalie almost didn't register it. She was carrying a tray of preserved fruit jars from the cold cellar to the kitchen shelf, and Vivian was in the corridor with two women Rosalie didn't recognize. Visitors from town, from the look of them, Vivian's friends or social acquaintances, the kind of women who visited ranches but didn't live on them. Vivian was showing them the house. She didn't stop when Rosalie came through with the tray. She simply continued her conversation, gesturing toward the kitchen without looking at Rosalie, and said to the two women, "The kitchen is through here. We've hired some help for the preparations." Some help. The way you'd say a cleaning service or a hired hand. The way you referred to something useful that wasn't quite a person. One of the women glanced at Rosalie as she passed. The other didn't. Rosalie put the jars on the shelf. She went back to the cellar for the next tray. She kept her face neutral and her thoughts to herself because she had a job to do and $68 of debt and a roof that wouldn't survive another bad winter. But she felt it. She filed it away with the other things she was filing. Graham found her in the kitchen at 9 that evening, still working. He stopped in the doorway. "You haven't eaten." She looked up from the prep table. "I had something earlier." "When?" "Noon." He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and went to the cold cellar and came back with a leftover half of bread and some cold sliced ham that one of the ranch hands must have left. And he put it on the table beside her like it was something he'd decided on and wasn't going to discuss. "Sit for 10 minutes, he said. "I'm in the middle of—" "It'll wait 10 minutes. She sat. She ate. He sat across from her and poured himself a glass of water and didn't say anything about how late it was or how hard she was working, because he was the kind of man who expressed concern through action rather than commentary, which she was finding she had more respect for than she'd expected. After a while, he said, "Those women today, Vivian's friends." Rosalie looked at him. "I heard what she said," he said, "in the corridor." "It's all right," she said. "It's not," he said, quietly but flat, not asking her to agree, just stating it. She looked at him. In the lamplight, his face was tired in a way she recognized, not from lack of sleep, but from the longer kind of tired, the kind that accumulates. She'd had that kind of tired herself for the past 2 years. "How long have you known her?" Rosalie asked. 11 months. He wrapped his hands around the water glass. It was an arrangement that made sense on paper. "Most arrangements do," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression was honest in a way that surprised her. "You're not going to tell me I should be happy about it," he said. "I don't know anything about your life," she said. "I'm not in the business of telling people what they should be." He nodded slowly. He looked down at the table. "She's not—" he started, then stopped. Started again. "Vivian is not what I thought she was when this began." "What did you think she was?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Someone who was unhappy and hiding it well. I thought I understood that." He glanced up. "I was wrong about what kind of unhappy." Rosalie finished the bread and sat with her hands in her lap. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing at the kitchen windows, that dry December sound that meant cold settling in for real. "Some people are unhappy because life has been hard on them," she said slowly. And some people are unhappy because they can't stand that other people exist. She looked at him. Those are different kinds of unhappy. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. They are. Neither of them said anything for another minute. Then Rosalie stood and went back to the prep table and picked up where she'd left off. Graham stayed a while longer, finishing his water, and then he said goodnight and went upstairs, and she heard his footsteps cross the floor above her head, slow and steady, and then nothing. By the end of the 4th week, the cold cellar held more preserved food than Rosalie had produced in any single project in her life. The smoked hams were exactly where they needed to be. The sauces were laid down in sealed crocks. The fruit tarts needed only their fresh pastry shells and filling to be assembled, and she'd worked out a system for that which would let her produce 40 in under 3 hours on the morning of the wedding. She was standing at the planning calendar on the back of her notebook, checking each completed item, when she noticed that her hands had stopped shaking. She hadn't realized they'd been shaking, not constantly, but just that fine tremor that comes from exhaustion and cold and a sustained level of anxiety you get so used to you stop noticing it. But it was gone now, and the absence of it felt like something. Graham came in with coffee at 5:30 in the morning, as he had every morning for the past 3 weeks, and set her cup where he always did and stood by the counter with his. She said, without turning around, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. "The land." She turned then, because this wasn't the kind of thing she could say to the back of a room. "The investors Vivian's family is dealing with. The railroad people." He was still for a moment. Then, "Where did you hear that?" "One of the ranch hands mentioned it without meaning to, last week. I didn't pry." He set his coffee down. His jaw was tight in a way she hadn't seen before. "What about it?" he said. "Is it true? That the marriage is connected to a land deal?" The silence went on long enough that she almost regretted asking. Then he said, "The Ashcroft family has interests with the Montana Pacific Railroad Consortium. They've been pushing for a right-of-way through the south end of my property for 18 months. I've said no. Vivian's father proposed the match about 2 months after the last negotiation broke down." Rosalie heard this and set the notebook down carefully on the prep table. "And you agreed to it," she said. "I thought—" He stopped, pressed his fingers against the edge of the counter. "I thought I could manage it, that the personal and the business could be kept separate, that Vivian and I might—" He stopped again. "I was wrong." "Have they been direct about it?" she asked. "About the land being part of the arrangement?" "They don't need to be direct," he said. "I've been doing business with people like that for 20 years. The implication is the communication." Rosalie looked at him. He looked like a man standing on ground he'd just realized was unstable. Not panicked, but recalibrating. The kind of recalibration that happens when you've been practical and reasonable for so long that you've run yourself straight into something you can't be practical and reasonable about. "Graham," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name without thinking about it. "What do you want to do?" He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the east windows now, the first thin gray of it, and it hit his face directly, and she could see every line of something working through him that he hadn't let herself look at clearly until now. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded. She picked the notebook back up. "The stock will need skimming in about an hour," she said. "There's more coffee in the pot." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." "For the stock or the coffee?" "For asking," he said, instead of pretending you hadn't heard. She nodded again and turned back to the stove and listened to him pour more coffee and stand there with it in the kitchen that was hers for 6 weeks, while outside the ranch slowly came to life in the cold gray dawn. 3 days before the wedding, Vivian came into the kitchen with a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who was apparently responsible for overseeing the social arrangements, and who had opinions about table presentation that she delivered in the brisk, authoritative tone of someone who has never actually set a table in her life. Rosalie listened. She agreed where she could agree, explained where she couldn't, and held her ground twice without raising her voice. Mrs. Aldridge was not accustomed to being held up and showed it in small ways. A stiffening of the posture, a pointed look toward Vivian. Vivian said nothing to resolve it either way. After Mrs. Aldridge was gone, Vivian stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the rows of preparation laid out across the tables, the scale and the order of it, the evidence of 6 weeks of sustained, careful work. "It looks like more than I expected," she said. It was the closest thing to a compliment Vivian had offered in 6 weeks of working alongside each other. "I hope you'll be pleased with it," Rosalie said. Vivian looked at her with those dark creek water eyes. "I intend to be," she said, "and I intend for my guests to be impressed." "They will be?" "With the meal," Vivian said. "Not with the cook." The words were said with a light, conversational lilt that made them almost deniable. Almost. Rosalie looked back at her and kept her face even. "I understood the terms when I accepted the work," she said. "Good." Vivian smoothed her glove. "I'd hate for there to be any misunderstanding on the day." After she left, Rosalie stood at the prep table for a moment. Her hands were very still. Then she went back to work because the bread starter needed attention, and there were still 40 pastry shells to plan for. And whatever else was true, the food was hers, and she was going to make sure it was the best thing that had ever come out of a Wyoming kitchen. The night before the wedding, Graham came to the kitchen later than usual. It was nearly 11. Rosalie had been working a slow, methodical check of everything that would need to happen the next morning. The sequence she'd run in her head so many times, it was like a practiced rote now, every step known. He looked tired. Not the physical tired, but the other kind. He sat down at the end of the prep table without being asked and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them. "She told me tonight," he said, "that after the wedding she expects me to revisit the land negotiation. As a show of good faith to her family." Rosalie kept her hands moving, checking the list. "What did you say?" "I said we'd discuss it." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to." He rubbed his hand across his jaw. "I've been telling myself for months that I could navigate this. Keep the ranch, keep the peace, make something work. That's what I do. I find a way through. And now?" He looked up at her. "Now I'm sitting in my kitchen the night before my wedding trying to figure out whether the thing I've been navigating toward is actually somewhere I want to go." The fire in the stove popped softly. Outside, the wind moved through the aspen trees in a sound like paper. "You don't have to answer to me," Rosalie said quietly. "I know that," he said. I'm not asking you to tell me what to do." He paused. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to tell me I'm being foolish." She set down the notebook. "You're not being foolish." He looked at her, and in the way he looked at her there was something she recognized from her own experience of the past 2 years, that particular quality of a person who has been very alone for a while and has stopped expecting anyone to see them clearly. She looked back at him steadily, because she could. "Whatever you decide tomorrow," she said, "make sure it's yours." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he stood and said goodnight and walked out. Rosalie stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she put her notebook in her coat pocket, turned the lamps down, and went to the small room off the corridor where she slept, and lay on the narrow bed with her eyes open while the Wyoming wind moved through the dark outside, and the wedding morning came slowly toward her whether she was ready for it or not. She was up at 3, not because the alarm she'd set pulled her out of sleep, but because sleep had stopped being a real option somewhere around 1 in the morning, when the wind shifted and she lay in the narrow bed listening to it and thinking about bread timing and sauce temperatures and the 40 pastry shells that needed to be assembled before 8 and trying very hard not to think about anything else. She dressed in the dark, by feel, the way she'd been dressing since childhood in a house that didn't waste lamp oil after sunset. Thick wool stockings, the heavy work dress she saved for long kitchen days, her mother's apron, which was not sentimental. It was simply the best apron she owned, deep pockets and double-layered at the front, and long enough to actually cover what it was supposed to cover. The kitchen was cold when she got there. She built the fire up first because everything else depended on that, and stood over it until she was sure it would hold, then started the coffee because the next 16 hours were going to require it. By 3:30 she had the bread dough coming out of its overnight rest and her hands were already dusted with flour, and she had found, as she always did in the first hour of serious work, that particular state of mind where everything outside the kitchen stopped being loud. The debt, the farm, the roof, Vivian, the conversation with Graham last night that she'd replayed 4 times before giving up on sleep, all of it receded to a low hum behind the immediate reality of dough and temperature and the sequence of everything that needed to happen in the right order. She worked. The hours moved the way hours do when you're using them properly. Not slow and not fast, but with a sense of purpose, that made the passing of time feel like something earned rather than something survived. By 5, the bread was shaped and rising. By 6, the pastry shells were laid out in rows, and she was making the first pass at the fruit filling, tasting and adjusting, the way her mother had taught her, not following a written amount, but following her own tongue, which knew more than any measurement she could write down. Graham came in at 5:45. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of his boots, which she'd learned to distinguish from Curtis and the other hands without realizing she'd learned it. He came through the back door and stopped just inside it the way he always did, like he was checking that it was still all right to be there. She didn't look up from the pastry work. Coffee's on. He got his cup and came to stand at his usual place at the end of the counter. He looked at the scope of what was laid out across the prep tables. The bread loaves resting, the pastry shells, the crocks she'd pulled from the cold cellar, the sequence of it all visible in the physical arrangement of the kitchen. And he was quiet for a moment. "It's a lot," he said. "It's what needs doing," she said. He drank his coffee. She kept working. The fire in the stove had the kitchen warm now, warmer than it usually was at this hour, and the smell of pastry butter and dried fruit filled the space between them in a way that felt almost physical. After a while, he said, "How are you?" She paused her work for half a second, just enough to register the question was more than a morning formality. Then she kept going. "Ask me after the bread comes out." He made a low sound that was almost a laugh. "Fair enough." They didn't speak much after that for a while. There was something between them now that was different from the first weeks. Not uncomfortable, but changed. Like two people who've said something real to each other and are both sitting with the weight of it, neither one sure yet what it means or what to do with it. The house above them was still quiet. The guests weren't expected until noon. Vivian and her attendant were in the east rooms upstairs, and Rosalie had heard, through Curtis and the way information moved through a working ranch whether you wanted it to or not, that there'd been a difficult conversation between Vivian and her father the previous evening, conducted in lowered voices in the front room while the household tried to be somewhere else. She hadn't asked what it was about. She didn't need to. Graham set his empty cup on the counter. He turned it once in his hands, the small habitual motion she'd noticed about him. He always turned things in his hands when he was thinking, cups, tools, whatever was nearby. "Rosalie," he said. She looked up. "Last night," he said. "What I said." "You don't need to." "I know I don't. I want to." He met her eyes. "I've been thinking about it since I went to bed. About what you said. That whatever I decide, it should be mine. I meant it." "I know you did. That's why I can't stop thinking about it." He set the cup down and pressed his fingers flat against the counter. "I've made a lot of decisions in my life because they made sense to other people, because they looked right from the outside, or because they were practical, or because I told myself I could manage whatever came from them." He looked at her steadily. "I'm good at managing things. It's not the same as wanting them." The oven needed checking. She checked it. She adjusted the heat slightly, closed the door, wiped her hands on the apron, and turned back. "Are you telling me something?" she said. "Or asking me something?" He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. It was honest, and she respected it. She nodded once and went back to the pastry work, and he stayed by the counter, quiet, turning nothing in his hands now because they were empty, until the sound of footsteps upstairs told them both that the house was waking up and the day was starting whether either of them was ready for it. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I should see to the horses," he said. "Graham?" she said, without planning to. He stopped. She didn't look up from the work surface. "The bread comes out at 8. If you're near the house, come and try it." It was a small thing, but the way he said "I will" before he went out made it feel like something else, and she spent the next hour not examining what that something else was, because there was too much to do and too many things she couldn't afford to want. Vivian came into the kitchen at 9. She was not dressed for the wedding yet. She had on a light robe over her underdress and her hair was down, and without the careful arrangement of her appearance, she looked younger and also, Rosalie noticed, harder. The kind of hardness that gets more visible when there's nothing decorating it. She looked at the kitchen the same way she always did, taking inventory rather than seeing it. "Is everything on schedule?" she said. "Yes," Rosalie said. "The smoked hams?" Coming up at 11. They'll rest an hour before slicing. The tarts? Assembled and ready, 42. She'd made 2 extra as a margin, which she didn't mention. Vivian moved along the prep table, looking at each thing without touching. She stopped at the bread and looked at the loaves Rosalie had pulled an hour ago, brown and even, and smelling the way bread smells when it's exactly right. "This is yours?" she said. "It's all mine," Rosalie said. Vivian picked up one of the smaller rolls and turned it in her hand, examining it with an expression that was difficult to read. Not dismissive, but not approving either. Something more complicated than either. "My mother used to make bread," she said. It was a strange thing to say, an unexpectedly personal thing, and Rosalie wasn't sure what to do with it. "Did she?" Rosalie said. "When I was small, before my father's business was what it is now." Vivian set the roll back down. "She doesn't anymore. She has people for that." Rosalie didn't respond to that, because she didn't know what she would say that wouldn't be something she'd regret. Vivian straightened and turned to face her fully for the first time in the conversation. In the morning light through the east windows, she looked like a woman who had been making calculations that didn't add up and had decided to stop looking at the figures. "Graham spoke with me this morning," she said. Rosalie's hands continued their work. She didn't let them stop. "He asked me," Vivian continued, in the same tone she might have used to discuss the seating arrangement, whether I was happy. The kitchen was very quiet around the sound of the fire in the stove. "What did you say?" Rosalie asked. "I said, of course I was." Vivian looked at the prep table. "What was I supposed to say?" There was something under the words, a brittleness, maybe, or something close to it. "He's been asking me things like that lately. Strange questions for a man who's known me less than a year." She paused. "He's been different since you came." Rosalie kept working. She shaped the last roll, set it on the pan. "How do you mean?" "More present," Vivian said. "More, I don't know. He looks at things differently." She said this without accusation, which somehow made it worse than if she'd been accusing. "He looks at people differently." Rosalie set the roll pan to the side and turned to wash her hands at the basin. She kept her back to Vivian while she did it, not out of rudeness, but because she needed a moment where her face wasn't visible. "I'm the cook," she said. "I've been here doing the work you hired me to do." "I know that." "Whatever else you're thinking, I'm not thinking anything," Vivian said, and then, more quietly, "I'm just telling you what I've noticed." There was a long pause. Then Vivian's voice came back to its regular register, smooth and social and impenetrable again, like a door closing. "Everything looks adequate, Mrs. Mercer. Please make sure the hams are ready to come up by 11. Mrs. Aldridge will want to inspect the table settings by 10. "They'll be ready," Rosalie said. She listened to Vivian's footsteps recede back up the corridor. Then she stood at the basin with her wet hands and looked at the wall for 30 seconds and thought about her farm and her roof and the $68 of debt that had brought her here, and told herself very clearly that she had 6 more hours of work to do and she needed to do them. She dried her hands and went back to work. The guests began arriving at noon. Rosalie heard them, the carriages, the voices, the particular sound of 200 people assembling in a place that wasn't used to that many at once. The main house filled up above her, and the noise of it came through the ceiling and the walls, laughter and greeting and the clinking of glass and all the social sounds of people who had put on their best clothes and come a long distance and intended to be impressed. She didn't go out to see any of it. That was the arrangement, and she had agreed to it, and she kept to the kitchen and the covered corridor and the cold cellar, moving between them in the tight focused circuit of the final preparation hours. Curtis had been assigned to help her carry things, which he did without complaint, and with the quiet efficiency of a young man who understood that staying out of the way was a form of skill. She directed him in clipped sentences, and he followed them, and between them they got the hams to the carving station that had been set up in the room adjacent to the main hall, the sauces into their serving vessels, the tarts onto the tiered stands that Mrs. Aldridge had specified, the bread into the baskets lined with cloth. A ranch hand she didn't know came to tell her the guests would be moving to the banquet hall in 20 minutes. "Thank you," she said, and kept working. The sauces needed to be at temperature. The bread needed to stay warm. There was a detail with the third ham. The skin had pulled slightly during resting, which changed how it would slice. and she adjusted her approach to it in the moment, which was something you could only do if you'd spent 30 years understanding the thing you were working with. She fixed it, and no one would know it had needed fixing. 15 minutes. She moved through the final checks with the same calm she always found in the last minutes before food went out. The calm that wasn't really calm, but was the thing that happened when you had done the work and the work had been good, and there was nothing left to do but let it be. She was wiping down the prep table when she heard Vivian's voice in the corridor. Not speaking to her, speaking to someone else. One of the women from before. The visitors. The voice was bright and social. The voice Vivian wore in public the way she wore good clothes. The most extraordinary preparation. I spent weeks planning every detail, every sauce, every course. Rosalie's hand stilled on the table. I have very specific ideas about food. I always have. It's important to me that these things are done a particular way. I'm afraid I'm quite demanding about it. The other woman said something warm and admiring that Rosalie didn't catch. Well, I did have some assistance with the physical preparation, of course. One hires people for that. But the vision, the choices, those were mine entirely. The voices moved away down the corridor, back toward the hall, back toward the guests and the event and the world where Vivian Ashcroft was the center of everything. Rosalie stood at the prep table with her hands flat on the surface. She breathed in once, out once. She picked up the cloth and finished wiping the table. Then she went to the cold cellar and stood in the cold for a minute, with the door closed and the dark around her, and let herself feel it. Not cry, not break, just feel the weight of it pressing on her chest. The particular weight of being erased so completely and so casually, of having someone take the thing you made with your hands and your knowledge and your 3 a.m. hours and claim it in a corridor without pausing her stride. She stood there until the weight stopped feeling like it would knock her over. Then she opened the door and went back out. She heard the toast through the wall. The guests had moved to the banquet hall and the feast had begun, and she could hear the muffled rise and fall of it, the laughter, the moments of quiet that meant someone was speaking, the collective murmur of approval she recognized as people tasting something and responding to it even when they couldn't find words. She had heard that sound in smaller rooms at smaller events, and it was the sound she cooked for. Not the compliments after, but that first unguarded response, the one that happened before people decided what to think. They were having that response in there. She could hear it. She cleaned the kitchen. She did it the way she always cleaned after a major production. Methodically, thoroughly, working backward through the stages until the space looked the way it had before she came. She washed every pot and pan and dried them and hung them where she'd found them. She scrubbed the prep tables. She put the remaining stores back in the cold cellar in the order she'd found them. She swept the floor. It took an hour and a half. When it was done, she stood in the center of the kitchen and looked at it, and it was clean and quiet and smelled of soap and wood smoke, and the ghost of everything she'd made. And in 6 hours or 6 days, the smell would fade, and the kitchen would just be a kitchen again, and no one who walked into it would know what had happened there over 6 weeks. She picked up her coat from the hook, her notebook from the shelf, her mother's apron folded from the table. She was putting on her coat when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Vivian's footsteps. Not Curtis. Graham came through the door. He was still in his wedding clothes, the good jacket, the white shirt, and he had the look of a man who had just made a decision and was still carrying the momentum of it, the way you look right after you've done something you can't take back, and you're not sure yet if that's terrible or the best thing you've done in years. He stopped when he saw her coat, her things, the cleaned kitchen. "You're leaving," he said. "That was the arrangement," she said. "The work is done." He looked at her. The noise from the banquet hall came through the wall, muted and continuous, 100 conversations happening at once. "Rosalie," he said. "Graham." She said it quietly. "Go back to your wedding." He stood in the doorway and something moved through his expression. Something she'd seen pieces of over 6 weeks, in the early mornings and the late nights, and the conversations that had gone longer than either of them intended. But she was seeing all of it at once now, and she didn't know what to do with it. "What she said in the corridor," he said. "I heard it." Rosalie went still. "I was coming to check on you. I heard her." His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man holding something in check. "About the food, about it being her vision, her choices." "People say things at their own weddings," Rosalie said. That's not what this was, and you know it. She looked at him. Her coat was on. Her things were in her hands. She was ready to go, and she needed to go because the longer she stood here, the more she was going to feel things she had specifically decided not to feel. It doesn't matter. The food is good. Your guests are happy. The work is done. It matters, he said. You matter. The kitchen was very still around those words. She looked at him and she thought about all the mornings and the conversations and the bread she'd made him taste at 8 o'clock and the way he turned things in his hands when he was thinking. And she thought about $200 and her roof and her farm and the long drive home and all the reasons she had come here that had nothing to do with this. Go back inside, she said. Not unkindly, but firmly. He held her gaze for another long moment. Then something settled in his face. Not resignation, not defeat. Something more like a decision being made in a different direction than the one she expected. All right, he said. I'll go back. He turned in the doorway. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her once, and his face said something his mouth didn't. And then he walked back down the corridor toward the noise and the guests and the 200 people who had come for a wedding. Rosalie stood alone in the clean kitchen. She didn't move for almost a minute. Then she picked up her bag and walked out the back door into the cold December air and went to get her horse, and the sound of the celebration carried from the house across the yard and followed her all the way to the gate. She was 3 miles from the ranch when she heard the horse behind her. The road back toward Heller's Creek ran through open valley for the first stretch, flat enough that sound carried, and she heard the hoofbeats before she saw anything. She didn't turn around immediately. She told herself it was probably one of the ranch hands, or a guest leaving early, or any of a dozen things it could reasonably be. Then Curtis pulled up alongside her on the gray gelding he always rode and said, breathing hard, "Mrs. Mercer, Mr. Whitlock says you need to come back." She kept her horse at the same pace. "I'm done for the day, Curtis." "Yes, ma'am, I understand that, but he said—" Curtis hesitated, the way a 17-year-old hesitates when he's been given a message he doesn't fully understand. "He said to tell you it's not finished yet." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the honest, uncertain face of someone delivering words he knows matter more than he's been told they do. She pulled her horse to a stop. The valley was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that comes in the gap between one weather system moving out and another moving in. The mountains to the north had clouds building behind them. The light was flat and gray and made everything look like it was holding its breath. "How long ago did he send you?" she said. 10 minutes, ma'am, maybe a little less." She sat with that for a moment. Then she turned the horse around. She heard it before she got through the gate. Not the steady noise of a celebration continuing, something different, something that had changed in register and pitch. The particular sound of a room full of people who have stopped doing what they were doing and are all paying attention to the same thing at once. Even from the yard, even with the walls between her and whatever was happening inside, she could feel the shift of it. She tied her horse at the post and went through the back door, through the kitchen she'd just cleaned and left, back down the corridor toward the banquet hall. The closer she got, the clearer the sound became. Not chaos exactly, but the sharp collective alertness of 200 people who have just witnessed something unexpected. She stopped at the door to the hallway that led to the hall and stood there. Graham's voice was carrying, even through the door. Not shouting, but pitched to fill a room. The voice of a man who had spent 20 years managing land and cattle and people and knew how to make himself heard without raising his hand. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he was saying, "in front of everyone here. Was this your plan from the beginning, Clarence? Or did it develop somewhere along the way?" A pause. Then a voice she recognized as older, heavier. Clarence Ashcroft, Vivian's father, who she'd seen once at the house on Main Street, and who had the face of a man who had never been asked a direct question he couldn't redirect. "Graham, this is neither the time nor the—" "It's exactly the time." Graham's voice didn't waver. "You've had 11 months to find a better time. You chose not to." Rosalie pressed her back against the wall of the corridor. She wasn't going in there, but she wasn't leaving either. She heard Vivian's voice next, pitched low and urgent, the social voice stripped away. "Graham, please, not here. You asked me this morning if I was sure about today." Graham's voice steady. "I told you I needed to think about it. I've thought about it." The room had gone so quiet she could hear the fire in the hearths. "The land deal," he said. "The right-of-way through the south pasture. The Montana Pacific Consortium that your father has been negotiating with for 18 months. The reason this marriage was proposed 2 months after those negotiations broke down." He paused. "I want everyone in this room to understand what kind of arrangement they came here to witness today, because I don't think many of you do." The silence stretched. Then Clarence Ashcroft's voice came back, lower and harder, the pleasantness gone. "You're making an accusation in front of—" "I'm stating a fact," Graham said. "The difference is that a fact doesn't require your cooperation." Rosalie closed her eyes for a moment. She heard the shift in the room then. Not panic, but movement. The rustling of people turning to each other. The low, urgent murmur of guests trying to make sense of something they hadn't prepared for. She heard a woman's voice ask something she couldn't make out. She heard Vivian say sharply, "Graham!" And then his voice again, quieter now, but no less certain. "I'm done, Vivian. I should have said that months ago. I'm sorry I didn't, because that would have been kinder for both of us." "You're sorry." Vivian's voice had changed completely, the polish gone, something raw underneath. "You're sorry? In front of my family, in front of every important person in this territory, you're telling me you're sorry?" "Yes," he said. "I am, for letting it get this far." And then Vivian Ashcroft did what Rosalie might have predicted if she'd thought about it clearly. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. She pivoted. The way people do when they've been in control their whole lives and the ground shifts under them. They look for somewhere to put the weight that doesn't expose them. She looked for somewhere to put it, and she found Rosalie. Wang. Rosalie heard her own name the way you hear something in a dream, close and far at the same time, real but wrong somehow. "This is her fault." Vivian's voice, carrying now, bright with anger and something else underneath it, the kind of desperation that sounds like certainty when it's performed well. "She's been here 6 weeks. 6 weeks in my fiancé's house in his kitchen, talking to him every morning. Vivian!" Graham's voice. "Don't." Sharp. "Don't defend her. Don't stand there and tell me it means nothing. Everyone in this room can draw their own conclusions about what happens when a man spends 6 weeks having private conversations with a woman he barely knows." The murmur in the room shifted. Rosalie felt it even through the door. 200 people adjusting their understanding of what they were watching, shifting from confused witnesses to an audience that has been given a story to follow. She stood in the corridor with her back against the wall, and her hands flat at her sides, and she thought, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, "I could leave. I could walk back through the kitchen and get on my horse and be halfway to Heller's Creek before anyone knows I was here." She thought about her farm, her roof, the $200 that was folded in the inside pocket of her coat right now, paid in full 3 days ago as per the agreement. She thought about the 6 weeks, the 3 in the morning hours, and the cold cellar, and the 42 pastry tarts, and the bread she'd pulled at 8 o'clock, and the stock that had simmered for 4 hours, and every single thing she had made and been told would not have her name on it. She thought about Vivian's voice in the corridor, the vision, the choices, those were mine entirely. And then she thought about Curtis riding after her on the gray gelding, saying he said to tell you it's not finished yet. She pushed open the door, sad. 212 people turned to look at her. She had thought about this moment for approximately 45 seconds in the corridor, which was not enough time to plan anything. And so she walked in with nothing but the awareness of her own feet on the floor and her own coat on her back and her own name in her chest, and she stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the room. It was the first time she'd seen what she'd made presented at scale. The long tables, the bread in the linen-lined baskets, the tarts on their tiered stands, the carved hams with their deep mahogany skin, the sauces in their vessels, the whole feast laid out in a room full of candlelight and dressed-up people who had been, until about 10 minutes ago, having the best meal of their recent memory. Graham was standing at the head of the room near the table where he and Vivian had been seated. Vivian was to his right, no longer seated, her face white and sharp as winter. Clarence Ashcroft stood behind her with 2 men Rosalie didn't know, but whose clothes said money and whose faces said investment. Mrs. Aldridge was near the back with both hands pressed to her mouth. Everyone was looking at Rosalie. She looked back at them for a moment. Then she looked at Vivian. "You told your guests," she said, in a voice that was not loud but that carried because the room was silent enough and she had decided to let it carry, that the vision and choices for this meal were yours. Vivian's jaw tightened. This is not your... I started the stock at 2 in the morning, Rosalie said, 6 weeks ago. The smoked hams took 4 weeks to develop. The preservation work, the sauces, the bread, every recipe, every technique, every decision made in that kitchen came from me. You told me what you wanted for your guests. I told you how to achieve it. Those are two different things. The room was very still. You hired me, Rosalie continued, and asked me to stay invisible. I agreed to that. I understood the terms. She paused. What I didn't agree to was having the work taken from me entirely. What I didn't agree to was being called somebody's help in a hallway and then having my name come up in this room as a convenient explanation for why your engagement is falling apart. Vivian's voice came back in a rush. You don't know what you're... I know exactly what I'm talking about, Rosalie said. Not shouting, not even sharp, just even. Because I've spent 6 weeks in your fiancé's kitchen, watching you treat the people around you like they exist to be useful to you and then to disappear. I stayed invisible because I needed the work, but I'm not going to let you make me the reason for something that has nothing to do with me. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The before silence was the silence of people who were waiting to find out what was happening. This was the silence of people who had just heard something true, said plainly in public, and weren't sure what to do with it. Clarence Ashcroft found his voice first. He had the voice of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and immediately taking charge of them, and he used it now, low, controlled, with the underlying promise of consequence. Young woman, he said, you are a hired cook. Whatever has been said in this room... Clarence, Graham's voice. Ashcroft stopped. Graham looked at him the way you look at something you've been studying for a long time and have finally categorized correctly. You've said enough, he said. You've been saying enough for 11 months. I think everyone here has heard the shape of what you're doing, even if they haven't named it yet. He looked at the two men behind Ashcroft, the railroad men, the investors, standing there with their carefully composed expressions. The Montana Pacific right-of-way through my south pasture. That's what this has been about. If anyone here was unclear on that, I hope the last few minutes have been illuminating. One of the railroad men started to say something, and Graham simply looked at him, and he stopped. Vivian was very still now. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't pointing outward anymore. It had turned inward in the way anger does when it runs out of targets and finds itself looking in a mirror. I would have been a good wife to you, she said quietly, just to Graham. The room almost didn't exist for a moment. He looked at her for a long moment, and his voice, when he answered, was not unkind. Maybe you would have. But you would have been a good wife to someone else's idea of who I should be. And I would have been a bad husband, because I'd have known it and done nothing about it. Vivian looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the door at the side of the room, and her attendant followed her, and after a brief charged silence, Clarence Ashcroft said something quiet to the two men beside him, and they moved toward the same door, and the room held its breath around their exit. Well, the sound came back slowly, the way sound does after something large has passed through. First one voice, then several, then the general rising murmur of 200 people who have a great deal to say to each other. Rosalie stood near the doorway she'd come through. She was aware suddenly of how she must look. Work dress, her mother's apron still folded over her arm, her coat on, clearly a woman who had been on her way somewhere else when she came in. Not dressed for this room. Not dressed for this moment. Just herself, as she was, standing in a room full of people who now knew her name. A woman at the nearest table, 60-ish, silver-haired, with the weathered competence of someone who had run a large household for decades, leaned toward her and said quietly, "The bread is extraordinary." Rosalie looked at her. "I mean it," the woman said. "I haven't had bread like this in 20 years. What is the flour-to-starter ratio?" Something in Rosalie's chest shifted, not broke, not opened, just shifted, like a door that has been stuck for a long time moving a fraction of an inch. "A long starter," she said. 12 hours minimum. Most people rush it." The woman nodded like she had expected as much. Someone else said something about the sauce. Someone across the room was talking about the hams. The conversation of the feast was reassembling itself around what it had been before the last 20 minutes cracked it open, and Rosalie stood in the middle of it and felt something strange and unfamiliar, which took her a moment to identify as the feeling of being exactly where she was, in a room where people knew what she had made and knew who had made it. She didn't know what to do with that feeling. She hadn't had much practice. Graham came through the people toward her. He looked tired and a little worn at the edges in the way that happens after adrenaline passes. But under that, he looked more himself than she'd seen him in the weeks she'd known him. Like he'd been carrying a weight so long he'd stopped feeling it as separate from himself. And then he'd set it down, and the unfamiliar lightness of it was still strange. He stopped in front of her. "You came back," he said. "Curtis is very persuasive," she said. He almost smiled. "It didn't quite make it all the way." "I didn't expect you to come in." "I didn't either," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something serious in his face, the same directness he'd had in all those early morning conversations when it was just the two of them and the kitchen and the dark outside. "What you said in there was what needed saying," she said. "I'm not looking for credit for it." "I know." He paused. "But it still took something." She looked down at the apron folded over her arm. She thought about the corridor, about standing with her back against the wall listening to her own name used as a weapon. She thought about all the times in the past 6 weeks she'd swallowed something and kept working, and whether that had been discipline or just habit, and whether there was a difference. "It did," she said. A ranch hand appeared at Graham's elbow. Older man, apologetic expression, something needing attention. Graham glanced at him and then back at Rosalie, and she could see him calculating the pull of different responsibilities, which was something she recognized because she was always doing it herself. "Don't go," he said to her. "Not yet." "I wasn't planning on it," she said. He went with the ranch hand. Rosalie stood there for a moment. Then she went to the table where the silver-haired woman was sitting and pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down, still in her coat, her mother's apron on her lap, in the room full of people who were eating the food she'd made and knowing it. The woman refilled her own glass of water and then filled the empty glass at Rosalie's place without being asked, which was a small gesture and possibly the kindest thing anyone had done for her all day. Outside the windows, the clouds from the north had finally arrived. The first snow of December began to fall in the flat gray afternoon, slow and indifferent, the way weather has no interest in the human events that happen beneath it. It fell on the ranch and on the mountains and on the road back to Heller's Creek, and it fell on Rosalie's horse still tied at the post by the back door, and on the kitchen she'd cleaned and left and come back to, and on whatever was going to happen next, which she couldn't see from where she was sitting, but which felt, for the first time in a long time, like something she might be able to face without bracing herself quite so hard against it. She looked at the table, the bread, the tarts, the carved ham, all of it still there, still hers, and she poured herself a glass of water and drank it. The snow kept falling through the afternoon and into the evening, and by the time the last guests had gathered their coats and called for their carriages, 3 inches had settled on the yard and the mountains had disappeared entirely behind a white curtain that made the world feel smaller than it was. Rosalie stayed, not because she'd planned to. She hadn't planned anything past walking back through that door, and what happened after was less a decision than a series of small things that added up to her still being there when the light outside went from gray to dark. The silver-haired woman, whose name turned out to be Eleanor Hatch, had kept her talking through the remainder of the meal with the focused curiosity of someone who takes food seriously and doesn't apologize for it. 2 other women had joined the conversation. A rancher from the Northern Valley had come over specifically to ask about the sauce. She had answered all of it in her plain, specific way, flour ratios and smoking times and what the juniper berries did to the acid balance of the reduction, and somewhere in the middle of it, the strangeness of being seen had started to feel less like something she needed to brace against. She was helping carry things back to the kitchen when Eleanor Hatch touched her arm. "I'm going to write to you," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "My husband's brother is hosting a Territorial Cattle Association dinner in February, 140 guests. He's been trying to find someone who can manage it for 2 months. Rosalie looked at her. "I'm going to recommend you," Eleanor said. "If that's all right." It was a simple sentence. Practical, direct. The kind of thing one capable woman says to another when she's identified a fit. But Rosalie stood there holding a tray of empty pastry stands and felt it land somewhere in her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. "It's all right," she said. Eleanor nodded as if that had been the only expected answer and went to find her coat. Yes. The house quieted slowly, the way large gatherings do. Not all at once, but in stages, the noise retreating room by room until what was left was the particular silence of a house that has held a crowd and is now settling back into itself. Graham found her in the kitchen. She was washing the last of the serving vessels she'd brought back from the hall, not because it was strictly her job at this point, but because it was something to do with her hands, and she had always thought better with her hands occupied. The fire was still good. The kitchen smelled of soap and wood smoke and the faint remainder of everything she'd cooked over the past 6 weeks, a layered smell that was already starting to fade. He came in and didn't say anything for a moment. He'd taken the jacket off at some point and was back to looking more like the man she'd met at 5 in the morning than the man who'd stood at the head of a banquet hall and told 200 people what was actually happening. He looked tired, genuinely tired. Not the performing function tired, but the kind that reaches down into the bones. He got the coffee pot. There might be a little left, she said. A little's enough. He poured what was there, which wasn't much, and stood at the counter and drank it cold. He looked at the window over the sink, at the darkness and the snow falling through it. After a while, he said, Ashcroft's people were threatening legal action before they left. She kept washing. On what grounds? Breach of contract, reputational damage. Take your pick. He set the empty cup down. Alderman Forsyth, he was one of the men with Clarence, told me I'd destroyed not just the engagement, but every business relationship the Ashcroft family had cultivated in this territory for 20 years. Is that true? Probably some of it. He sounded neither proud nor sorry about it. The railroad deal is dead. Clarence will make sure of that. There are 2 other contracts I was in the middle of negotiating that will likely walk away now because they don't want the association. He paused. I knew that when I made the decision. Rosalie set down the vessel she'd been washing and turned to look at him. And? She said. He looked at her. And I'm still standing here. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the sink. There'll be talk, she said. There's already talk. Half those guests are on their way back to town right now. By tomorrow morning, it'll be in every parlor from here to Cheyenne. About you and Vivian. About everything. He set his hands flat on the counter. Including you. She'd known that. She'd known it from the moment she pushed open that door and walked into the room. She had known, in the specific and practical part of her mind that had always been clearer than she wanted it to be, exactly what it would mean for a widow with a struggling farm to walk into a broken engagement and say what she'd said. I know, she said. People are going to draw conclusions. People have been drawing conclusions about me since Thomas died, she said. That's not new. It's different now. Yes, she said. It is. She finished the last vessel and stacked it and dried her hands on the apron. But what I said in that room was true, and it needed saying, and I'm not going to make myself sorry for it. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not asking you to be. She looked at him. Then what are you asking? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the counter, at his hands on it. Outside, the snow was still falling, steady and indifferent. Nothing right now, he said finally. It's late. You should sleep before you drive back. He straightened. You can have the room off the corridor. It's yours through tonight. It was practical, and she was tired enough not to argue with practical. All right, she said. She left the next morning before 7. The snow had stopped in the night and left the world white and clean and brutally cold, the temperature the kind that gets into your clothing within the first minute and stays there. She hitched her horse in the dark of the barn, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and loaded her things into the wagon by feel. Curtis appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse with his coat half-buttoned and his hair still flattened from sleep. I'll get the gate, he said. Thank you, Curtis. He walked alongside the wagon to the gate and swung it open. She drove through and stopped on the other side and looked back at him. You did good yesterday, she said, coming after me like that. He ducked his head in the way 17-year-olds do when they're pleased and don't know what to do with it. Mr. Whitlock said to. I know, she said, but you did it right. She drove toward Helder's Creek in the early winter morning with the mountains showing again, clear and pale above the snow-covered valley, and she thought about Eleanor Hatch's letter, which hadn't arrived yet but would. She thought about the roof, which she could now afford to fix. She thought about the bank, and the fence, and the particular relief of a debt paid that she hadn't let herself feel yet because she'd been too close to everything. She didn't let herself think about the kitchen at 5 in the morning or the way Graham turned things in his hands when he was working something through. She drove home. The talk was exactly what she'd expected, which didn't make it easier. Hellers Creek was a town of 400 people, which meant it had approximately the information-sharing capacity of a single large family at a table. By the time she drove in the following Tuesday for supplies, the story had already taken on the particular texture that stories get when they've been told too many times. Some things exaggerated, some flattened, a few details entirely invented that had a life of their own now, regardless of what had actually happened. The version going around at Dunmore's Feed and Grain when she came in for flour had her confronting Vivian Ashcroft in the middle of the wedding toast. The version at the dry goods store had Graham calling off the wedding specifically because of her, which made her jaw tighten in a way she worked to keep off her face. There was a third version, shared by Mrs. Pelham at the post office with an expression of concerned neutrality that meant she believed every word of it, that questioned what exactly Rosalie had been doing alone at that ranch for 6 weeks. She bought her flour and her salt and her dry goods, and she said very little and kept her expression the way she kept her kitchen, clean and orderly and not giving away more than necessary. She had been managing what people thought of her for 2 years, and she was not going to stop being capable of it now. But it sat in her, the talk. She was honest enough with herself to admit that. It sat in her chest the way cold gets into clothing, not immediately terrible, but present and building. The letter from Eleanor Hatch arrived 11 days after the wedding. It was 2 pages, efficient and warm in equal measure, and it confirmed what Eleanor had said. Her brother-in-law, a man named Harmon Hatch, who ran one of the largest cattle operations in the Northern Valley, wanted a cook for a February dinner, and Eleanor had recommended Rosalie without reservation. The offered pay was $150. Rosalie sat at her kitchen table and read the letter twice, and then sat with it in her hands for a while. She thought about what it meant. Not just the money, though the money was real and necessary, but the thing underneath the money. That someone who had sat at that table and tasted what she'd made and seen what happened after had looked at Rosalie Mercer and thought, I want her for my people. Not despite what she'd said in that room. Maybe in some way because of it. She wrote back to Eleanor that afternoon and said yes. The roof was fixed in the second week of January by a carpenter named Pete Gunderson, who was competent and overpriced, and she hired him anyway because the north corner had developed a new crack over Christmas, and she was not going to lose another winter to it. He worked for 3 days, and she fed him lunch both days he was there because it cost her less than an extra hour of his labor, and because she cooked the way she always cooked, not for effect, but because it was the thing she knew how to do, and doing it right was not something she could turn off for an audience of one. On the last day, Pete Gunderson sat at her kitchen table and ate her braised short rib over cornbread and was quiet for almost the entire meal. When he was done, he set his fork down and said, "Mrs. Mercer, you cook like this for a carpenter on a work day?" "I cook like this," she said. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. "My wife's cousin is organizing a spring social for the Stockmen's Association. April. They've been trying to find—" "Tell her to write to me," Rosalie said. He did. The cousin wrote. These things happened slowly, and then not so slowly. Eleanor Hatch's letter, then Pete Gunderson's cousin, then a rancher named Walcott who'd been at the Whitlock wedding and tracked her down through Curtis in February to ask about a spring branding feast for 60 men. She said yes to Harmon Hatch's dinner, and yes to the Stockman's social, and yes to Walcott, and she kept her farm running in between because the farm was hers and she was not going to lose it, and she learned to organize her life around both things with the same methodical attention she brought to a kitchen. She was tired most of the time. She was also, for the first time in 2 years, not afraid. Graham Whitlock came to her farm on a Thursday in the middle of February. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, working on a test batch for the Hatch dinner, and she looked out the window and stood very still for a moment when she saw who it was. He tied the horse at the post and came to the door and knocked. She opened it. He looked like himself. Not the wedding day version, not any particular version, just the man who had stood at her kitchen counter in the dark at 5 in the morning, turning an empty coffee cup in his hands. "I should have come sooner," he said. She held the door open. "Come in." He came in and she went back to the stove because the sauce on it didn't care about timing. He sat at her kitchen table without being asked, the way a person sits down in a space where they feel the particular ease of somewhere that makes sense to them. "The talk in town," he said. "I know about it," she said. "I went to see Alderman Forsyth last week, and two of the others who were at the wedding." He paused. "I told them directly what the situation was, what it wasn't." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't. People are going to think what they think regardless." "Some of them," he said. "Not all." He looked at the table. "The ones who matter, the ones whose opinion actually affects your livelihood, I can reach most of them. I have. Or I'm working on it." She turned back to the stove. She stirred the sauce. She thought about the fact that he had done this without telling her, without asking whether she wanted it, and she was deciding how she felt about that. "You could have asked me first," she said. "You're right," he said. "I should have." No justification, no explanation of his reasoning, just agreement. She stirred the sauce. "How's the ranch?" she said after a while. "Standing," he said. The Ashcroft legal threats didn't amount to anything. Forsyth and the other investors pulled back from Clarence's deal independently. Apparently the terms were already going sideways before the wedding. I just didn't know that. He paused. "I've picked up 2 new cattle contracts in the North Valley. It's not what I had before, but it's solid." "That's good," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "Curtis asks about you." She almost smiled. "Tell him I said hello." "He'd prefer you tell him yourself." She didn't say anything to that. The sauce needed tasting. She tasted it, adjusted, tasted again. She was aware of him sitting at her kitchen table in the way she was always aware of where he was in a room, which was something she'd stopped pretending not to notice somewhere in the 4th week at the ranch, and hadn't gone back to pretending since. "There's something I want to say to you," he said. "All right," she said. "I'm not going to say it today." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes steadily. "Because you've had 6 weeks of your name in other people's mouths, and I think you need more time before I add anything to that. And because I need to be sure that what I say is what I mean and not what I've been feeling since December, which is not always the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment. This was the most careful she'd ever heard him be with words, which was saying something because he was generally not a careless man. "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to be." She turned back to the stove. "Stay for coffee," she said. He stayed. They sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee while the February light came through her windows at a low winter angle and made the familiar room look slightly different than usual. And they talked about the Hatch dinner and the Walcott branding and the north fence she'd had to restring in January and a problem he'd been having with a water line to the east pasture, and outside the cold held and the bare trees stood still in the pale afternoon, and neither of them said anything significant or necessary, and both of them knew it, and that was all right. He left before dark because the road back was 18 miles, and he didn't want to make it in full dark on snow-covered ground. He got his coat and his hat, and she walked to the door with him. He stopped on the porch and looked out at her farm. The repaired roof, the restrung fence, the yard with its thin covering of old snow going gray in the fading light. He looked at it the way she'd seen him look at things he was trying to understand from the outside. "It's a good farm," he said. "It's getting there," she said. He looked at her then, and whatever it was he had decided not to say today was visible in his face. Not hidden, just held. Deliberately, carefully, the way you hold something you intend to put down in the right place at the right time. "I'll see you, Rosalie," he said. "You will," she said. He rode out of the yard and she stood on the porch and watched him go until the road curved at the cottonwood stand and she couldn't see him anymore. The cold came in through her coat and she let it for a minute before she went back inside. The sauce on the stove needed attention. She gave it attention. She stood at her own stove in her own kitchen with the lamp burning against the February dark and worked through the rest of the afternoon in the particular quality of quiet that isn't loneliness, but is the presence of something that hasn't arrived yet, something that has a shape and a direction, and is moving toward you at its own pace, which is not your pace, but which is maybe the right pace, and which you can be patient about if you've decided to trust it. She could be patient. She'd been doing hard things alone for 2 years. She could afford to be patient about something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, like something worth waiting for. The hatch dinner went well, not perfectly. The third sauce broke 20 minutes before service because the kitchen at the Hatch property ran hotter than she'd accounted for, and she had to rebuild it from scratch in 15 minutes with Curtis, who Graham had sent along without asking because he'd somehow understood she'd need an extra pair of hands, working beside her and following her instructions without question. They got it done. Nobody in the dining room knew anything had gone wrong, which was the only measure of success that mattered in a kitchen. Harmon Hatch paid her in full the next morning and shook her hand and said, "Eleanor was right about you," which was both a compliment and a reminder that she now existed in a network of people who talked to each other, which was a different kind of existence than the one she'd had 6 months ago. She drove home through the February cold with the money in her coat and Curtis riding alongside her on the gray gelding, talking about nothing in particular: the horses, the weather, a problem in the north pasture, the way he'd started learning to bake bread from the recipe she'd left posted in the Whitlock kitchen in December, and had so far produced 3 loaves that were, by his own admission, better used as building materials than food. "You're rushing the ryes," she said. "How do you know? You haven't seen them." "Because everyone rushes the ryes. It's the thing people can't resist. You have to leave it alone even when it seems like nothing's happening." He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Whitlock says the same thing. About different things." She kept her eyes on the road. "He's been different," Curtis said. Not accusatory, just observational, the way young people sometimes say true things because they haven't yet learned to weigh them first. "Since December, I don't know, more settled maybe, like he stopped waiting for something. Or started," she thought. But she didn't say it. March came in cold and left warm, the way Wyoming March does, unpredictably, on its own schedule, with no particular interest in what anyone had planned around it. The Stockman's Social was the first Saturday of April, 60 people in a barn that had been swept and strung with lamps for the occasion, and she produced a meal for it that people were still talking about in Heller's Creek 3 weeks later. Word moved through the territory the way water moves through dry ground, finding channels she hadn't dug, reaching places she hadn't aimed for. A letter came from a ranch 2 counties north, another from a hotel in Cheyenne that had heard her name from someone who'd been at the Hatch dinner. She answered each one carefully, practically, with the same attention she gave to a recipe. What was needed, what she could provide, what it would cost, how long it would take. She said no to 2 of them because the timing conflicted with the farm, which still needed her, which would always need her. She was not going to build something new by destroying what she'd already kept alive. Thomas had left her with the farm and the debt and a handful of tools and the 40 acres of clay soil that everyone said was too hard to work. She had worked it anyway because it was hers, and that was still true, and she was still paying attention to it. The north fence held through winter. The roof held through 3 hard snowstorms. The land was beginning, slowly and without drama, to produce the way land does when someone pays it consistent attention over a long period of time. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, which is the only kind of progress that actually holds. She was aware during these months of a change in herself that she didn't examine too closely, because examining things too closely had a way of making them self-conscious, and she didn't want that. But it was there. She moved through her days differently than she had for the past 2 years, with less of that constant low-grade bracing, the tensing against that had become so habitual she'd stopped feeling it as tension and just felt it as the way she was. It was loosening, slowly, and the loosening felt strange, almost suspect, like a held breath being released so slowly you couldn't pinpoint the moment you'd stopped holding it. Graham came back in March, then April. Each time he came to the farm, he stayed for coffee, and sometimes for a meal, and they talked the way they'd always talked. Practically, honestly, about real things. The ranch, the farm, the work. Occasionally about Thomas, because she was finding she could talk about Thomas now without it feeling like pressing on a bruise, which was something she hadn't expected grief to do, and which surprised her. She mentioned it to Graham once, the surprise of it, and he said, "Grief changes shape when you start using your hands again," which was not a poetic thing to say, but was accurate in the way that non-poetic things sometimes are. He was not pushing her. That was the word she kept coming back to. Push. He was not pushing anything, not toward him or toward a decision or toward any particular future. He came, and he was present, and he said what he thought when she asked him and didn't say it when she didn't, and he went home and gave her the space of the days between, and it was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in years, and she was still learning how to receive it without looking for the catch. She'd been looking for the catch in everything for so long it had become a reflex. You get burned enough times, you start checking the temperature of every room before you walk into it. He came on a Thursday in early May when the aspen on her property were coming into leaf, that particular yellow-green that only lasts a week before it deepens into summer green, and you've missed it if you weren't paying attention. She'd been paying attention. She was in the habit of it. He came around the side of the house rather than to the front door, because he'd learned that she was usually not inside in the mornings, and he found her at the north fence checking the wire she'd restrung in January, which had held through winter but which she wanted to assess now that the ground had thawed. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the fence and then at her. "It held," he said. "It held," she said. She pulled at a section of wire, testing tension. It was good. Better than she'd expected, honestly. She'd done a decent job in January under difficult conditions, and the work had held, which was satisfying in the specific way that things you do yourself and do right are satisfying. Graham leaned against the fence post with his arms crossed and watched her work. He'd been doing that since December, watching her work without making it into anything, without the quality of waiting that makes a person feel observed. It was more like the way you watch something you find genuinely interesting. "I need to say something to you," he said. She kept her hands on the wire. "I figured that's why you came on a Thursday." "You noticed that." "You've come on Thursdays," she said. "Since February." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't realize it was that regular." "It is," she said. "I don't mind it." She let go of the wire and turned to face him. The May morning was mild and the aspen behind the house were shimmering in a light wind, and the mountains were fully visible, the snow line still high but receding. "Say it then." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him, the quality of a man who has decided what he means and is going to say it without dressing it up. "I told you in February that I wasn't going to say what I wanted to say until I was sure it was what I meant and not just what I was feeling," he said. "I'm sure now." She waited. "I didn't stop that wedding because I was embarrassed," he said. "I didn't stop it because of the land deal, though that was real and I'd have had to address it eventually. I stopped it because I was standing at the head of that room and I could hear you in the kitchen." He paused. "I could hear you working, even through the walls, and I knew you were going to leave when it was done. And I realized that the woman I should have been standing next to was the one I'd spent 6 weeks talking to at 5 in the morning, because those were the only hours that felt like they actually belonged to me." The wind moved through the aspen. Somewhere on the property, a bird she couldn't see was making a sound she'd been hearing every morning for a week and hadn't identified yet. "That's the truth," he said. "All of it." She looked at him. She thought about the corridor, about standing with her back against the wall, listening to her name used as a weapon. She thought about the 3 in the morning hours, and the stock and the bread, and the particular quality of the silence between them that had never been the silence of strangers. She thought about February, sitting at this same kitchen table with the winter light coming through the windows, and the thing he had decided not to say yet that had been visible in his face anyway. She thought about Thomas too, because she was honest enough to think about Thomas, about what their marriage had been. Not bad, not without love, but uneven, built in the years before she understood her own capacity clearly. Thomas had not seen all of her. He had seen enough to love her, but not enough to know what he was loving, and she had been so grateful for the love that she hadn't noticed the gap. She had spent 2 years after he died understanding herself in the silence he left behind, which was a lonely way to learn something, but was real learning nonetheless. She knew more about herself now than she had at any point in her marriage. She knew what she was capable of, and what she needed, and what she was not willing to disappear into again. She looked at Graham and she thought, "He has seen me work. He has seen me hold my ground. He has seen me swallow something and keep going, and he has seen me when I stopped swallowing it. He has seen the gap between those two things, and he has not tried to close it or manage it or redirect it into something more convenient." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I just needed to be sure that what I felt was mine and not just reaction to everything that happened, to being seen after a long time of not being." He nodded. He understood the distinction. That was one of the things about him. "And now?" he said. She picked up the wire tool she'd set down and turned it once in her hand. "Now I'm telling you that I'm not going anywhere. That I'm not a person who will disappear into someone else's life, even someone's life I care about. That my farm is mine and my work is mine and I make my own decisions about both." "I know that," he said. "I need you to keep knowing it," she said. "Not just today." "I will," he said. Not the easy agreement of someone saying what they need to say to get to the next moment. The flat, considered agreement of someone who has thought about this already and arrived at it honestly. She put the wire tool in her coat pocket. She looked at the fence, the work she'd done, the work that it held, and then she looked at him. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside. Ishem. They were not easy with each other all at once. That would have been its own kind of dishonesty. The kind that looks like a good ending but is actually just an unwillingness to live in the complicated middle where real things happen. There were conversations that were hard. There was the question of the land, not the railroad land, but the question of whose land mattered more, whose life centered where, what it would mean practically for two people who both had rooted working properties 18 miles apart. They talked about it plainly, without performance, in the way of people who have both had enough experience to understand that a problem named clearly is at least a problem that can be navigated, whereas a problem avoided just waits for a worse moment to surface. There was the question of what people would say, which they had decided together to address by living in a way that gave people accurate things to say, not by performing respectability, but by being actually respectable, which is a different thing and requires less maintenance. There was a morning in June when she drove to the ranch to use his larger kitchen for a preparation job that wouldn't fit in hers, and she worked in that kitchen for the first time since December, and it felt different than it had. Not worse. Not haunted. Just the kitchen of someone she knew well, smelling of wood smoke and coffee, with the east windows and the morning light, and the particular arrangement of things that reflected 18 years of one person using the same space. She moved through it with the ease of familiarity. She knew where the good knives were and why the third burner ran hotter than the others and how the draft in the stove behaved in a north wind. She knew these things because she'd spent 6 weeks learning them, and the knowing felt like its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. Graham came in at 5:30 with coffee and set her cup where he always had, and she looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway and thought, with the plain clarity of something finally arrived at, this is where this has always been going. Not inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, but right. The particular rightness of things that have taken their time and not been rushed and have therefore arrived at themselves fully rather than half-formed. Eleanor Hatch came to the farm in July. She came with 2 women Rosalie hadn't met, a Mrs. Creighton from the Northern Valley, who ran a household staff of 12 and organized events for the Territorial Ranching Association, and a younger woman named Ada, who turned out to be her niece and who was starting a catering enterprise in Cheyenne and had come specifically to talk with Rosalie about technique. They sat in Rosalie's kitchen for 4 hours and she fed them, and they talked about food the way she had always wanted to talk about food, seriously, specifically, without the quality of indulgence that people used when they thought cooking was a nice hobby for a woman rather than a serious craft. Eleanor asked sharp questions. Mrs. Creighton had strong opinions about preservation that differed from Rosalie's in interesting ways. Ada wrote things down and then crossed them out and wrote them again when she changed her mind, which Rosalie recognized as the sign of someone actually learning. When they left, Eleanor took her hand at the door and said, "There are people in this territory who have been waiting for someone who knows what they're doing. I hope you understand that." Rosalie looked at her. "I'm beginning to," she said. After they were gone, she stood at the window and looked at her farm in the July afternoon. The roof, the fence, the garden she'd planted in April that was producing more than she'd expected, and she thought about the word invisible, which had been the condition of her existence for so long she'd stopped questioning it. She thought about what it had cost her, not the 6 weeks in someone else's kitchen under someone else's terms. That was a transaction, and she'd understood the terms when she'd agreed to them. But the longer invisibility, the years of making herself smaller, of swallowing things, of keeping her face neutral in corridors while people talked past her. The way she'd learned to take up as little space as possible because the world had made it clear in 100 small and large ways, that her presence in certain rooms was a convenience rather than a right. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her but not seen her fully. She thought about Vivian, who had needed her invisible because visible she was inconvenient. She thought about what it had felt like to walk through that banquet hall door in her work clothes with nothing planned and her own name in her chest and say the true thing in front of 200 people, and how terrifying it had been and how it had also felt, underneath the terror, like something overdue. The truth she'd arrived at slowly over the months since December was this. The problem had never been that she was invisible. The problem was that she had cooperated with it. Not out of weakness, out of necessity, which is different. Necessity is a real thing, and she didn't apologize for it. But necessity had gradually become habit, and habit had gradually become the shape of her life. And somewhere in those 6 weeks in Graham Whitlock's kitchen, she had started to remember that she had a different shape underneath it. She didn't know if the person who had emerged from all of it was better or worse than who she'd been before. She knew she was more honest, more clear-eyed about what she wanted and what she was and what she would and wouldn't accommodate, more patient with the things worth being patient about and less patient with the things that weren't, more willing to sit in discomfort when the discomfort was honest than to resolve it into something false. Those things had cost her something to become. Most real things do. She and Graham married in September. It was not the wedding anyone in Heller's Creek might have predicted, which was probably fitting given that nothing about the past year had gone according to anyone's prediction. It was small. The minister's parlor in town, with Curtis and Eleanor Hatch and Pete Gunderson and his wife as witnesses, and a supper afterward at the farm that Rosalie cooked herself because she didn't know how not to, starting at 4 a.m. the way she started any serious work. Eleanor came early to help and spent 2 hours in the kitchen with her being genuinely useful, which Rosalie appreciated more than she said. Graham arrived at noon and found her still in her apron and flour on her forearm, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her across that kitchen at 5 a.m. for 6 weeks, with full attention, without reservation, and said, "Are you going to change before we go?" Or, "Yes," she said. "Give me 20 minutes. Take 30, he said. There's no rush. She took 22. She put on the gray wool dress she'd bought in Cheyenne in August because it was well made and she'd earned something well made, and she looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Not long. She wasn't the kind of woman who spent long in mirrors, but long enough to see someone she recognized, someone she'd been working back toward for 2 years without knowing it was the goal. The ceremony was brief and honest, and they both meant what they said without needing to make it ornate. The minister was efficient. Curtis cried a little and was embarrassed about it, and Graham shook his hand and said nothing, which was the kindest response. They drove back to the farm in the afternoon light with the valley spread out on either side of the road and the mountains going gold in the September sun, and neither of them said much of anything because they had already said the things that needed saying over the course of 10 months of early mornings and hard conversations and February visits and the long, slow work of 2 people deciding, carefully, what they were to each other. They kept both properties for the first 2 years. It was complicated and required planning, and there were weeks when the distance was exhausting and neither of them pretended otherwise. But the farm was hers, genuinely hers, not in the way of something tolerated, but in the way of something woven into the structure of who she was. And she was not going to fold it into someone else's story. And Graham understood that because he'd spent 20 years feeling the same way about his own land. What they built between the 2 properties was not neat. It had seams and working edges, and the occasional argument about logistics that went longer than either of them wanted. But it was theirs, constructed deliberately by 2 people who had both been through enough to understand that the value of a thing is not inversely related to its difficulty, that in fact the opposite is often true. The work continued and grew. The catering engagements multiplied with the particular momentum of reputation honestly earned. Each event producing 2 or 3 more, a network of ranchers and associations and territorial families who knew Rosalie Mercer's name and what it meant. She hired a young woman named Dora in the 2nd year to assist with the large events, and Dora was not skilled when she arrived, but was earnest and fast and willing to be taught, and Rosalie taught her the same way her mother had taught her, directly, with specifics, not softening it for a listener she thought couldn't handle it. Dora could handle it. "Why 12 hours for the starter?" she asked once, elbow deep in bread dough. "Because that's what it needs," Rosalie said. "But why?" "Because you can't rush the thing that makes everything else work." She looked at her. "Some things only happen on their own time. Your job is to set them up right and then leave them alone." Dora looked at her with the expression of someone who suspects they've been told something that applies beyond bread, and then she went back to the dough. Rosalie went back to her sauce. Corn. The following spring, a woman came to the farm. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon unannounced, which Rosalie didn't love, in a hired carriage from town, which meant she'd come some distance. She was maybe 30, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who was managing limited resources with maximum dignity, and she had the look of someone who had practiced what she was going to say. Rosalie met her at the door. "Mrs. Whitlock," the woman said, "my name is Clara Baines. I was told that you sometimes take on people who need work, who need to learn." Rosalie looked at her. The woman was not quite meeting her eyes. The particular avoidance of someone who has been told no enough times that they start pre-building defenses against the next one. "Who told you that?" Rosalie said. "A woman named Dora, who said you'd taken her on when she didn't know much and taught her properly." A pause. "I cook. I've always cooked. I just never had anyone tell me I was doing it right." Rosalie stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. She thought about a notice tacked to a post outside a feed store, printed on cream paper, that she'd pulled down and folded and put in her pocket on a November morning 2 years ago. She thought about walking into a room where she was expected to be useful and invisible, and then walking out of it and coming back and saying the true thing out loud. She thought about the first loaf of bread she'd ever made that was exactly right. She'd been 12, and her mother had said nothing but had nodded once in the particular way that meant, "Yes, you understand now," and that nod had been worth more than any compliment because it acknowledged what was real without decorating it. "Can you be here at 4 in the morning?" Rosalie said. Clara Baines blinked. "In the morning? That's when the serious work starts," Rosalie said. "If you can't be here at 4, we're not a match." "I can be here at 4, she said. Rosalie stepped back and held the door open. "Come in and have coffee. Tell me what you know and what you don't." Clara came in. Rosalie closed the door behind her and went to the stove and put the coffee on. And outside, the spring afternoon settled over the Wyoming Valley, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the aspens were coming into that particular yellow-green that only lasts a week, and you have to be paying attention to catch. She was paying attention. She had been, for a while now, to the bread and the land, and the early mornings, and the people who showed up at her door needing something real. She had learned, over the course of 2 years of difficult and often graceless becoming, that being seen was not something that happened to you when the world finally noticed you deserved it. It was something you built by refusing, enough times and in enough ways, to cooperate with your own disappearance. It cost something, that refusal. It cost comfort and safety and the low-grade relief of keeping your head down. But what you got in return was the ability to look at your own life and recognize it, to stand in your own kitchen at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning or whatever hour the work demanded, and know that what was happening there was yours, made by your hands, done in your name, and belonging to no one else. That was not a small thing. That, she had learned, was everything.